Brains in Motion with Mary McKone, EdD and Angela Zielinski, DPT. Please remember that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. This is not medical advice, and this is just general discussion for educational purposes. Thank you. Enjoy. Hi, Mary. How are you?
I'm good. So excited to be back again for another episode.
Yes, I'm excited too. So today we are going to do an in-depth case study on emotional regulation. So it's going to be, we've done a previous case study where we had a guest and we kind of just talked about different ideas. We've also talked about emotional regulation in a past episode and its different foundations. So if you want to listen to that, I think it's episode 4. And then today we wanted to take a very individualized and specific case study of a client with no identifying information, but we wanted to give a lot of examples and structure it a little bit differently because we thought it would be more helpful for learning or seeing how we use reflex integration. So Mary, could you get us started and kind of share a little bit more about this specific case?
Sure. So self-regulation isn't just a behavioral problem. Although behavior is a piece of the puzzle, it's what you see. It really is about sensory processing and our reflex integration and that darn vagus nerve. And those are the foundations of emotional regulation. So, Angela, I'm sure that you see this as well, and I see it all over the Facebook group. Parents are posting and asking questions about meltdowns and impulsivity and shutdowns, complete social withdrawal. You know, I've had kids that were crying and melting down for an hour at a time, 4 or 5 times a day when we started working. I mean, pretty much the whole day is a seesaw of emotional dysregulation. And I certainly understand how overwhelming that can be for parents. And self-regulation really takes place in the prefrontal cortex, and particularly the left hemisphere overrides the emotional responses from the limbic system out of the right hemisphere. As it turns out, the left hemisphere is the second one that rapidly develops, right? I think we've talked about this before, that the right hemisphere develops more rapidly the first 3 years of life, and the left hemisphere develops more rapidly the second 3 years of life. So when there's a delay in that development of the left hemisphere, you will absolutely see issues with emotional regulation. So regulation depends on 3 interacting systems: the sensory processing system, the autonomic regulation, which is handled by the vagus nerve, and then our primitive and postural reflex integration, which provides our postural support and connections between areas of the brain in addition to our motor movement. And it helps develop all of our senses, right? So there's really an intertwining of all 3 of these. So you could look at them as like 3 legs on a stool, right? They're all interconnected, but they help hold up this thing we call emotional regulation. So I thought we'd talk about like a specific kiddo. Again, there is no identifying information. 3-year-old child, severe separation anxiety from birth, so severe that the only person who could hold this kiddo up until the time I met them at 3 was mom, not even grandma, which is a nanny. That broke my heart, I have to say. Really high levels of social anxiety. Preschool drop-off was very emotional, lots of tears, meltdowns, refusal to go in, would not talk or play with peers at school, and really great difficulty with emotional regulation, lots of tears throughout the day, crying, need for comfort and co-regulation, but only from mom. So this is similar to a lot of kiddos that I work with. I just exited this kiddo, so I have a kind of a full history of them. So I thought it would be a good way for us to kind of go back and forth between the theory and ideas and then how it would apply to an actual child. So I thought that would help people kind of conceptualize and visualize what it really looks like in practice.
Yeah, I think I appreciate that, and I like that it's specific, and it's also interesting to talk about when you were talking about the opening and how you were laying down our foundational pieces. There's a real development and intertwining that happens, so sometimes it can get confusing because a 2 to 3-year-old, it is absolutely typical to have meltdowns some of the times, right? That is part of typical development. And so sometimes it's hard to decide, is this typical or is this more than typical or is this different? And so like having a specific case example, I think could be helpful because when you were saying like severe separation anxiety from birth and would only let mom hold them, it's interesting to note, like, okay, that is typical for a short period of time. And then that's supposed to change and grow. And they are supposed to learn about stranger danger at a certain point. That's actually one of the things we look for. Can you tell who's mom and who's not mom? But the difference is those high levels of anxiety and that inability to regulate with only just one person until they're 3. That's how we know that's something we want to intervene with.
Absolutely. And, I think another thing to think about is how impactful is the emotional dysregulation? How is it interfering with the daily life of the family?
Yes.
So I have 2 young granddaughters. They get upset about things. Sometimes little Peanut will throw herself on the floor for about, I don't know, 5 seconds. And then and she's a little over 2. She realizes she's not getting what she wants. And she's like, well, darn. And then she's up and moving on to something else. That's completely normal. It's temporary. It's an inconvenience. You're like, she needs to regulate. But when it goes on for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, or the child's inconsolable, or you're changing what you do during the day to avoid a meltdown, we might have something there that needs to be addressed.
Yes. And I think of that a lot with reflex integration too, of like, are you stuck and unable to progress? Or are you just having a little bit of gross motor? You're learning your body and maybe, you're having a little bit of trouble, but you move through it. That would be the question. Are you stuck or are you moving through it? And I think that's important to remember. And again, helpful to have more specifics as we're chatting about this.
Mm-hmm. What emotional regulation is. And we did about this in the other episode, but in case you're dropping in and hadn't listened to that one, maybe we can review that a little bit. Angela, how would you define the difference between emotional regulation and compliance?
Ooh, which are not the same.
They are not the same, but they often get mistaken as being the same.
That's yes. So a compliant child is one who may do what you are asking them, but they still feel uncomfortable or dysregulated on the inside. So it's a lot of what the term I feel like is going around right now is masking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing what you're asking, but it's coming at a cost of me feeling really uncomfortable on the inside and not having an ease. And often, if you feel ease, you will be more compliant. But sometimes, if you feel ease, you'll have a little bit of pushback because you'll feel safe. You might negotiate instead of just being like, yes, or you put your head down and go do what you are supposed to do. I think that's what I think of. How about you, Mary?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that was a great definition. You can be regulated and compliant. You could be regulated and non-compliant. You can be compliant and dysregulated, but still do what was told. I'm old, so I'm almost 60. And if you're over 60 and you're listening, I don't mean that offensively. I just feel old some days. And when I was young, at that era, parents would say, you better stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. And you sucked it up and you quit crying. Then you did whatever was told of you because you didn't want something worse to happen. And I was compliant, but also still dysregulated, right?
Yes. And I feel like we're in the era of learning what that means and how that looks differently. Like again, the word masking and what
Yeah.
the emotional cost comes with that or how it looks. And so I think that it, it's just important to note. I like that note that
Yeah.
compliance and regulation don't necessarily mean the same thing.
A lot of the kids that we work with mask all day long. I'm going to
Yes.
say that again. A lot of special needs kids are masking all day long. They're holding in their emotional dysregulation, their sensory processing deficits, their difficulty with executive functioning. And then when they get home, they have nothing left in the tank. And so mom and dad or caregivers are seeing the full brunt of that when they let everything go because you're the safe person and they just can't mask anymore. And so it's like, blah, it all comes out when they walk in the door or get in the car from school, right? And
Mm-hmm.
keep that in mind, this idea of masking, they're just trying to keep it all together because there's expectations on them. And some kids, if they have enough cortical activity, in the higher part of the brain, they can do that. But other kids just can't. They can't
Mm-hmm.
keep it together. So you're seeing more behaviors at school.
Yeah.
All right. How about bottom up versus top down regulation? So we talk about bottom up development a lot because reflexes are primarily regulated through brainstem cerebellum, primitive reflexes. So what is bottom up regulation?
To me, bottom up regulation means using strategies like reflex integration to help with behaviors or sensory processing or things that help the lower areas of the brain that Mary has talked about. And then for me, top down, I think of as the words people use. So, like, I recently found that Daniel Tiger, who's like, gentle squeeze, nice and slow, take a deep breath, let it go. That would be top down because you have to think about the steps
Mm-hmm.
and implement them. But if you don't have the foundation or the bottom of it, no amount of singing that song is going to work. How about you, Mary?
Yeah. So when I was thinking about this, like if a child is regulating bottom up, it's the limbic system and brainstem that's driving the show. And vagus nerve runs right through the brainstem, by the way, through the mesencephalon. So when we feel upset, our limbic system fires off and says, "Gosh, that's not fair," or "Man, I wanted a popsicle." If if we're regulating emotions from the bottom up, the limbic system is running the show. And limbic system and vagus nerve, those two things run hand in hand, right? So we move into sympathetic or dorsal vagal out of parasympathetic, which is rest and digest. And we're going to talk more about that later in what probably will be a 2-part episode here. In a top down regulation, it is the neocortex that's regulating our emotions. So we may get that limbic system response, "Man, I wanted a popsicle." But then our prefrontal cortex says, "Yeah, but you already had dessert," or "Mom said you didn't eat your dinner," and you may still be disappointed, but you have that regulation to be able to be like, "Okay, I don't need to throw a fit," or "Mom said 10 more minutes," or "Wait till after lunch." Okay, I can do that, right? So if we don't have enough cortical activity, particularly insular cortex and prefrontal cortex, then we're not going to get that. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and their ABA therapist told them to just keep extinguishing the behavior. So ignoring it to extinguish it, right? So if you just ignore the behavior, the child will stop. And that is behavior mod 101. But let me explain why that doesn't work with a lot of kids. In order for extinguishment to work, the child has to be able to make a social judgment. They have to be able to observe that mom or dad are ignoring them, that they're not going to get what they want, and then problem solve their way out of that prefrontal cortex, and then make decisions about what to do about it, and then take action on that. What that requires is a lot of activity in the insular cortex, which is in the frontal lobe right behind your prefrontal cortex. So all the information from our inner body through our vagus nerve, our interoception, goes up to the insular cortex. All of our sensory information coming from the outside world comes into insular cortex. And then insular cortex says, hey, limbic system, do I need more information? Hey, parietal lobes, do I need more information? That's sensory. Hey, prefrontal cortex, what should I do about this? And so all of that information comes in there at the same time. And then the prefrontal cortex can say, oh, I see that look on mom's face, and she's going to be really unhappy if you throw a fit right now. So what do you think you should do about that? Oh, you should probably just say, okay, mom, and let it go. But if we don't have good sensory processing, vestibular, perception, auditory, visual, if we don't have good interoception, that information's not getting to the insular cortex. We can't make that social judgment. So how many kids on the autism spectrum with more significant symptomology have that social judgment? I mean, that's a key component of autism, right? Is understanding of social awareness. And how many kids do we work with that have poor sensory processing? So extinguishment is based on things that they don't have in their toolbox yet. So I don't find that to be a successful tool for kids who are lacking those skills, because you're working too high for where they are developmentally. That just came up the other day, and I wanted to mention it because it's relevant to this topic, and it's something that I've heard quite a bit. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think that the key is assuming you need all of these things, you're making an assumption on a regulated nervous system. And if you have a dysregulated nervous system, you can't access higher levels.
Yes.
Or it doesn't mean anything because it's so, all the data is confused or skewed, right? So even if the information gets there and they can process it, it might not give the meaning that we're looking for. It might mean something completely different to them than we're assuming.
Mm-hmm. Right. A really great example of that is in an underdeveloped proprioceptive and tactile system. Sometimes the brain can read touch as pain.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it is, in fact, pain, but that's dysregulated. So that information comes up into the brainstem and the parietal lobes, and the brain says, "Oh my God, that's painful." And then we've got incorrect information driving the decision-making process and the emotional responses. And you hit on such an important point about you can't access higher order thinking when the limbic system or dysregulated nervous system is ruling the day, right? So when a kid is in a big emotional state, it's not the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex running the show. It is a limbic system, right? And that's our emotion centers. The brainstem and the limbic system are like, nope, I'm in charge. They are flooding and they are shutting off our ability to problem solve and get through there if that level of development exists. But we've all been there. We have all been in those places where you're just so overwhelmed emotionally, even as an adult. You're like, I cannot think right now and I cannot talk to you right now. Like, this is not the time for problem solving. I need to go curl up in a ball right now. And when I feel better, then we can come out and figure out how to handle this. I think we've all been there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've been there, and one of my best ways to regulate is to go into a room by myself so I can just have and a lot of that is sensory processing. There is less sensory input or demands for me if I'm by myself.
Yes.
And I don't have to process as much information. So like I played a lot of sports and I played basketball. So I use the word, I need to use a timeout, because to me, a timeout is like regrouping, setting a game plan, and like I'm getting a rest, I'm getting a water break, whereas timeout has a different connotation for some kids. But I really enjoy a good timeout of like, I just need to be by myself, regroup, and then I can go back out and play. Like, that's how I think of it.
Yeah. I'm going to say this. I'll probably repeat it too. A child who is melting down is not choosing poor behavior. They are operating from a lower brain state. A child who is melting down is not choosing poor behavior. They're operating from a lower brain state. If you can stop and recognize that, it's not that the child is just ill-behaved. They're operating from a lower brain state because they don't have those pillars that we've talked about before that provide the support and the access to the higher parts of the brain. And Angela and I were chatting about this earlier today, that, when a kid lacks internal organization, what do they need more of, Angela?
External organization,
Yeah.
external support
Yeah.
to help, especially when you're younger, because you're supposed to have that co-regulation. That support is supposed to be
Hmm.
safe, familiar adults, parents modeling.
Yeah. But even as a high school teacher, I taught reading for most of my career, and all of my kids had been in special, or a lot of them had been in special ed their whole lives. I had all the behaviors. I had kids who were already been to jail for drug dealing, and, I had them all. And so self-regulation wasn't really high in that environment, right?
Right.
So I created an incredibly structured classroom because they didn't have the ability to contain themselves. And if I had even 5 minutes of downtime, that's when the hyenas come for you. So we, I really do love children and I loved teaching, but if you've ever taught high school, you know what I mean. You can't have any downtime. It's not a good thing. So creating extra structure then allowed them to have a container, right? Like they had boundaries for where their emotions could be, right? Where their cognition, where their thoughts could be. It's like, oh, let's reel that back in. So sometimes there's a tendency to create less structure because it may cause the child some emotional distress, but really they need those boundaries and that structure to help them feel safe. It's a really important component.
Yeah. And so getting back to our, as we digress, but getting back to our 3-year-old, we know that they are coming from the emotional state, right?
Mhm.
They're having the limbic system. They're 3. So not only is it appropriate to be coming from a lower brain state, but it is also this time that you're supposed to be shifting. This is when you're supposed to be learning. And so the frequency and the amount that it is affecting life is why there should be some intervention. And I'm a big fan of prevention too. So even with this case study, it's specific, but all kids can benefit from reflex integration and some emotional regulation. And there was this nice specific example with good outcome. And
Yeah.
so we've got our outline, but I think it would be helpful. Can we learn a little bit more about um the case study? I think we're gonna give her a name. Is that right?
Yeah. So let's call her Lila.
Okay.
Uh, so next, we're going to talk about sensory dysregulation because that's so important for emotional regulation. So for this child, she had lots of sensory challenges, right? So like at birthday parties, she wouldn't leave mom, mostly sit on her lap, really couldn't separate at all, withdrew at preschool, couldn't engage with the group. She'd kind of sit in the corner by herself. In school, let's see, found public spaces overwhelming, high levels of anxiety, clinging, crying, you know, looking to mom for co-regulation and safety. And in fight or flight, crying is an emotional version of flight. A kid doesn't have to elope to be fleeing. Crying and melting down is a form of emotional flight and for the sympathetic state of the vagus nerve. And I think it's always helpful to kind of look for clues, right? So, what clues were in this kiddo's history that might make us think there's some sensory processing, or that might cue this child up for sensory processing difficulties? Very quick birth, 4 hours, no complications, no intervention. So, that's good. No emergency C-section, wasn't hypoxic, but a really quick birth. So this child didn't get a ton of that proprioceptive input that babies get from contractions and moving through the birth canal. Did get some of it, but not as much as kind of normal 12-hour labor. Between the ages of 1 and 2, this kiddo fell a lot. So what, from your perspective, Angela, what might that be a clue of if a child falls a lot?
That usually tells me that there's some lack of reflex integration going on. the question is when I watch them move, is it lack of grounding? Is it ATNR? Is it STNR? But falling a lot tells me that there's some lack of integration and that there's some disconnect between the proprioception and the brain and the connection in vestibular. And those connections to me mean reflex integration. So that's those pieces. Something is not computing or going up fast enough, or they're asymmetrical. That's what I think of. How about you, Mary?
Yeah, for sure. I immediately, when kids are falling over a lot, I think, vestibular proprioception. Those two systems have to work together all day long to keep us upright. So every time we shift position, the vestibular system is telling proprioceptors, hey, we're telling the prefrontal cortex, hey, we're shifting position. You need to do something about that. It fires off messages to muscles to contract and extend so that we can compensate for the movement and still have fluid movement. So there's a real disconnect between those two. And in that birth history, I think, it starts with proprioception. It would be my guess. This child was also clumsy, so that kind of goes in with that as well. Lots of bumping into things and wanted to lean on everything, including mom. So again, looking for proprioceptive input and co-regulation. Tongue tie. So there's some speech articulation challenges and a lisp. Very talkative, as little girls can be at the age of 3. Very articulate, but doesn't know when to stop talking. Like there's no stop. That makes me think basal ganglia thalamus loop, that basal ganglia thalamic loop there. And the child would hold their urine for hours and hours and hours. So makes me think vagus nerve, right? And poor interoception.
Proprioception, the interoception piece, I feel like is underrepresented. That I feel like interoception also goes in with like clumsiness and bumping into things. It's proprioception is very important and vestibular, but like that not knowing where you are in space is also an internal feeling of like being in your body. Do you know how to not only move it, but do you know what's happening inside? Like, does it hurt when you hit that counter, or do you just kind of keep going and didn't even notice that you even hit it?
Oh, that's a good point. I haven't read this in the research yet, but it seems to me that interoception, the development of interoception is pretty dependent on strong proprioception. And it makes sense developmentally because the interoception is regulated by the vagus nerve. So if we have underdevelopment in proprioception and vestibular, the brain will not feel safe. And so our vagus nerve will continue to be in a sympathetic state. And then when we're in sympathetic or dorsal vagal, we don't feel our internal state well, right? So if we're that way since birth, we didn't get that development, which is a lot of the kids that come my direction, right? They have had poor proprioception since birth. So now that we kind of looked at the clues of this particular case in sensory processing, maybe although we did an episode on sensory processing, maybe we could kind of go back and review what sensory processing is and then how it's related to the emotional regulation piece. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. So sensory processing is how the brain receives, interprets, and organizes information from the body and the environment. So it's not just the 5 classic senses, right? What we see, hear, taste, touch, but it includes vestibular and proprioception, like we said. And then interoception is part of that as well. And interoception monitors internal body signals like hunger, thirst, heart rate, butterflies in the stomach, anticipation, things like that. Do you think we need to review vestibular and proprioception more?
I think we could give it a quick highlight, but I feel like we talk about it a lot, which is a good thing because it's so important.
So the proprioception is about body awareness, grounding, and movement. It's not just about where I am in space. You have 7 types of proprioceptors. They tell you everything from pressure, pain, temperature, movement, right? Where you are in space is certainly part of it. You even have proprioceptors in your hair follicles, which every time I say that, I think it's super cool. So when proprioception's not well regulated, we see things like bumping into others, using too much or too little force, difficulty feeling grounded in their own body, right? And then vestibular, although the like centers, semicircular canals and such are in your middle ear, the neurons are in the cerebellum, which is super interesting. Neurons for the proprioceptors also in the cerebellum. They're neighbors. So one stimulates the other. So it tells us about head movement and position relative to gravity, works closely with vision and proprioception to coordinate movement and balance. When vestibular processing is off, children can either be movement seeking and impulsive, or fearful and cautious about movement. So kids who never stop moving, they're pacers. It's really a proprioceptive and vestibular issue, because their brain's like, I don't know where you are. I don't know where you are. You better keep moving. I don't know. Hello, because that is about survival. The brain has to know where we are to keep us alive. Okay, that's our quick overview. Go.
So then interoception, and it's how your internal states are felt. Things like hunger. Do you have hunger cues? Do you even know if you're hungry? Fatigue, tension. Do you know if you need to go to the bathroom? I meet a lot of kids that I am so focused on something and then I have an accident. And the question is, did you feel the cue, or did the cue not even come on? And that's I feel like a very big interoception piece that plays a role. And I feel like auditory and tactile they're all interconnected, because when you just said the piece about if you're always in fight or flight, you can't pick up your interoception. Like, why would you be able to do that? I think that is so true.
Oh, in polyvagal theory, and if you've ever read The Body Keeps the Score, but it talks about how you hold trauma in the body is what that particular book is about. But there's such a great discussion about our autonomic nervous system and the physiological responses to that. One of the physiological responses to being in dorsal vagal is our proprioception shuts down, because it's the brain's way of keeping us safe so that we don't feel whatever terrible thing is about to happen or already just happened. So part of the dynamic of when the people are like in a bad accident and they get out of the car and they're walking around and their head is bleeding, it's not just the endorphins. It is also that their proprioception is shutting down because they're in this deep trauma response. And so they're not actually even connected to their own body. They can't even feel what's going on. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the extreme example of what's happening at a low level.
Yeah.
For a lot of kids, honestly, and people. I mean,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of adults who walk around in that state, even from childhood trauma, and they're still walking around disconnected from their body and doing things to feel alive because they can't feel their body. Right. So some dangerous behaviors, like, sometimes extreme sports, or when people are ultra risk takers, or an effort to feel alive because they can't feel their own bodies. In our kids, though, we just see it with, like, there's such a disconnect. And when there's a disconnect with your own body, then how can interoception function, right? Because it's regulated by the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is like, well, you don't need that right now. So we'll just shut that off right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to the sensory regulation piece, Mary, there's different responses of the sensory system. Can you tell us more about that? And then we'll talk about your thoughts about this specific case with Leela and that.
Yeah, sure. So we can be over responsive. And when we're over responsive in our regulation, we may have really high avoidance and lots of meltdowns and anxiety. We may be under responsive, where we're like really seeking input. We may be highly impulsive. We have poor sensory integration, which then leads to unpredictability in responses. Again, if our brain's not getting the right information to act on because we have underactive sensory channels, it's not being processed correctly. The brain's not getting accurate information to make judgments on. How do I respond? Well, if my auditory system is underdeveloped, I'm not going to process all frequencies the same. I may not even process some frequencies at all, particularly the higher ones. Those are harder to process. And so if I'm in a state of hypervigilance, my brain may also interpret every noise as a threat to survival. So I'm not getting accurate information in for my limbic system and vagus nerve to make a decision about. And so I'm having responses to things that I shouldn't have if everything was working correctly because of the dysfunction there. So that's why it's so important to look at behavior as, is this really a behavior? A child is choosing to do something just because they want to. I wanted a cookie, so I stole a cookie. That certainly happens in childhood, right? Or is it because the child isn't processing what's coming in through their senses, proprioception, vestibular, auditory, visual, tactile correctly? And so it's overwhelming the brain and the limbic system is taking over.
Yeah. So from like the case study, the clues were clumsy, bumping into things, and then a quick birth. So that tells us there may be some sensory processing challenges, and that possibly is showing up with the limbic system piece, like you talked about, with the difficulties with birthday parties, difficulty with school settings, and the high levels of anxiety, clinging, and crying. Is that
Yep.
so? That's what kind of you're processing, right? Of what you're thinking. Okay, I know these sensory processing pieces can lead to or affect each of these pieces. Is that
Yeah, absolutely. And when I am working with a kid who has emotional regulation issues, which is 97% of them to one degree or another, I will always start with proprioception because you have to create safety in the brain to calm the autonomic nervous system down. If a child's system is overwhelmed, what they are being told all the time internally, you're not safe, you're not safe, you're not safe, you're not safe. So by activating proprioception, stimulating that cerebellum through, squeezes and brushing and vibration, we're sending all of that information in the cerebellum and into the brainstem. And the brainstem's like, oh, you're okay. I know where you are. Cool. All right. So it can bring things down a notch, right? And pull them. The way I look at it is like, a lot of kids are sitting right on the edge of the cliff, right? And so there's no threshold for them. There's no distance away from the cliff. So every little thing sends them off the edge of the cliff into the chasm of emotional dysregulation. So when we provide that deep proprioceptive input and create safety, then we get further away from that cliff and they have more room to move because they're not always living in the state of, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that piece of one of the reasons I like MNRIs, the embrace and squeeze, like I've seen a lot of different the more we do this podcast, the more things pop up on my social media feeds, right?
Yep.
But the way MNRI does it is slow and very targeted, and you move in a very calm way. And so that co-regulation of whoever is doing the embrace and squeeze is a really big component of showing, see, I'm also here with you doing this and modeling that. Not only is your body feeling proprioception and getting that deep work in your body, you also have somebody who's present with you and counting with you and moving slowly to create that safety.
And it is hard for some parents to slow down and do that because the reality is raising a special needs child can be very stressful. Some of my parents have multiple kids with special needs. And, you may also be working and trying to handle life and you've got aging parents and you yourself are kind of on your cliff's edge. And so taking that time to be present can also help mom or dad regulate as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I often give them a count, so when we hold an embracing squeeze, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, slow release. And what's our key word from Pamela Curley?
Pause.
Move our hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slow release. Pause. Move our hands. It takes time, but it's so impactful when it's slow and regulated, and it helps regulate both folks and co-regulate both the caregiver and the child. Yeah. And there's other things that really help with that too. Some of the gentle rocking motions from RMT are great. Facial tapping, because you're affecting the trigeminal nerve, and facial massage, particularly for RMT, rocking the bottom and rib cage rocking are, those are, babies do those naturally to self-soothe. I find those to be the most calming of all the RMT movement, specifically looking for this particular thing. And then from brain gym, I use a lot of naval radiation, which is kind of the underpinnings of six-ended star. If you're an MRI person, naval radiation, it uses the same pattern. You're just tracing the child's body with your hand in those, one limited time, homologous, which is both arms and then both legs, and then homolateral, which is one-sided, and then contralateral. That kind of input is so calming to the brain and really allows the brain to feel safe so that they can come back off of that cliff face. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I also see that you did some pre-birth movements and archetype movements, and those I think of as like very foundational.
Oh, yeah.
Again, talking about how if you don't know where you are, you got to start by giving your body a foundation of movement, where to start from.
Yeah, for sure. So in RMTI, they're pre-birth movements, and MNRI, they're archetype movements, slightly different. I mean, very different in the way they look, but both happen in utero. So they're all like gestational movements. But the reason those can be so effective for calming is that usually in utero was a safe place for baby. So you're reaching back into consciousness at a time when the world was safe and all was well before they came into this big, scary world. For this case, and this presentation, not just this case, for this presentation, this was an at-term baby. So we're not talking about like an ultra preemie or whatever, but it really did help with the calming. It was like, oh, I kind of remember this movement. That's awesome. But it's just fascinating to me to watch a kid kind of like melt, in air quotes, when they do some of these. You really are tapping into something pre-birth that, we're just learning a lot about consciousness. There's a lot of very interesting research going on into what consciousness means, but we hold memories pre-verbally, and babies hold memory from being in utero. So it's a way to kind of access that and allow their brain to kind of reset. Like, oh yeah, that was a safe time in my existence. I like it. Plus, you're working on motor patterns that you'll also use for reflexes. So you get two things out of that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, again, verbiage around reflex integration, people think it's just one thing, but everything we just described isn't specifically working on one reflex. It's getting the system ready and prepared. So starting point for emotional regulation is preparing the system for change, is what I think of. You can't just change the system.
Yes. I say that a lot. And when we're in sympathetic or dorsal vagal, the brain is resistant to change. Mm-hmm. It's like, nope, that's not safe. I'm going to hunker down right here. Thanks. Mm-hmm. So when you calm that and help the child work back into parasympathetic, then the brain is open to new possibilities. Like, oh, there could be a different state of being out there for me. How interesting.
There could be a different state.
Right?
Yes. And I, now that I have this tool, I use craniosacral to help me with that piece as well, especially if kids are too sensitive to touch or infants need a little bit more space. it's an interesting piece of Mary.
Into the possibilities is one of the descriptions of being in parasympathetic.
Ah,
Both
yeah.
emotionally and cognitively. Oh, there's possibility there, right? Like as adults, to make the, for the people who are listening, it's like, do you remember when you had your first big breakup and you're like, I'll never love anybody again? It's the end of the universe. But at some point, your brain is like, well, that guy's kind of cute. At some point, you let that go and your brain's like, oh, there's a possibility of loving again, right? Because that emotional piece of losing somebody that you really cared about puts you into sympathetic or dorsal vagal. And so you have to come out of that before the brain's ready to be like, oh, maybe there's a possibility that I could, in fact, care for somebody else at some point down the line.
Yeah. And so this is the foundation piece. You start with sensory processing, and then we would be moved to neural reflexes.
Yeah.
When the body is prepared for some change or is open to the possibility of a new pathway, there are different pathways we can explore.
Well, as we come to the end of this episode, we are going to continue this on another episode. And some key takeaways to think about as we leave this part of the discussion. And next time we'll be talking about the reflexes and vagus nerve, and then kind of talking about the process that I went through with this kiddo. Some practical takeaways for this episode. So think about reframing behavior, right? Are there sensory pieces that you're seeing that could be contributing to the meltdowns or the resistance? Remember that shutdown, resistance, demand avoidance, that's a form of emotional shutdown, right? So it's not just about melting down, can also be demand avoidance. So look for the state of the nervous system and look for clues in the sensory system and in history. So if you're the parent and you're like, oh, my kiddo was an emergency C-section and did have the cord wrapped around their neck and they did need oxygen at birth, those are some clues that maybe their nervous system from the beginning said this world is not safe and their proprioception may have been affected. If they were a C-section, it was for sure. And so that gives you a starting place, right? It gives you, well, I probably shouldn't work all the way on STNR yet when my kiddo is still struggling to know where they are in space, right?
Yeah. I would also say kids that had a preferred side, also think about proprioception in that piece as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I see that a lot. And then thinking about some simple supports for this part is, including movement before demands. I'll give you a quick example of this. When I was a high school assistant principal, we had a kid that had a very explosive temper, and she had a pretty awful life up until the time she came to that high school. But before we could talk, we walked the campus like 3 or 4 times. That girl needed to walk and walk and walk and walk. Once she could regulate again, then she was able to talk her way through it. And then we were able to get her calm and back into class. And it's very touching. She invited me to her high school graduation so that I could witness her graduate, even though I wasn't at the school anymore. But if you think about our littles, if we offer movement before demands or the time to cocoon, go into a quiet place without the sensory demands, it doesn't have to be movement, that can provide their sensories, take off that load off the sensory system so that they can then come back into sympathetic. Yeah.
You have a great question here is speaking of that, of like key questions to ask is what sensory input may be affecting your child.
Yeah.
Think about the noise levels. Think about lighting. Think about textures. All of those pieces play a role. To me, I think of haircuts, and people forget that scissors have a sound. Hair has a sound. The cape around your neck is a weird feeling, and the lighting, and it's this unfamiliar environment. So what sensory pieces are also playing a role in the task that you're trying to help your child with.
And the proprioceptors in your hair follicles. So,
Proprioceptive in the hair follicles. You're moving them all around, right?
right? And they're like, oh no, that's not safe.
Yes.
So I just want to thank everybody who's been listening. We just continue to get really great feedback and people telling us they've learned a lot and it's helping them really understand their kids and deepen their practice as practitioners. So we're very grateful. We only started this to help people have a better understanding of this work and how to help their kids. And it is a lot of work, but it's been so rewarding professionally. And I'm really glad that you're finding it beneficial. So thanks for listening. Please feel free to share it with somebody that you think would benefit from it. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and also on YouTube. And you can find all of the episodes on my website at www.brain-works.org also.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary. And thank you, everyone. We will do part 2 of this in 2 weeks.
All right. See you then.
You can email us at brainsinmotionpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Mary at her website, brain-works.org, or on Facebook with her Facebook Reflex Integration groups. If you would like that information, please check our show notes. And you can find Angela at angelapt.com or rainbowdragonbooks.com. Thanks for listening.